Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming to listen to the glorious, the one and only Ruth Ozeki. Another round of applause, please. Because it's one thing to write a very exceptional book, but yet another to be an extraordinary human being. And there's not one Ruth Ozeki, but many, and I'm sure you're going to meet some of them today. But I'm very excited about this session. Briefly, Ruth, you are an author, filmmaker, teacher, and Zen Buddhist priest. Yeah. And this is your book, the book of Form and Emptiness. It's a really unusual piece of work. It won the Women's Prize for Literature, a very prestigious prize. It was the winner last year. It's experimental in form. It has, for example, the voice of the book. The book speaks to us. It has consciousness. Also, you don't just write it, but you're in it. You're there. I clocked you. I reckon it was you, wasn't it? I recognized you. But the experimentalism does in no way act as an obstacle to the warmth and humanity. And I'm hoping we're going to experience some of that in Ruth's reading today. Would you like first to introduce us to the two main characters, to Benny and to Annabelle?
Sure. Well, the book is really about a young boy named Benny O, who, after his father dies, starts to hear voices. And he starts first hearing his father's voice, but then that subsides, and then he starts hearing the voices of ordinary objects around him in the house. And these, he's of course quite disturbed about this. The voices follow him out of the house and to school, where he gets into all sorts of trouble, as you can imagine. And he ends up on a pediatric psych ward. And that's, a real struggle for him. When he's discharged, he realizes that school is no longer an option, and so he finds refuge at a large public library. And so the most of the book is really set in the public library, where he meets this denizen of characters who help him come to terms with this, the voices that he's hearing. So that's kind of the overview. And then his mother, Annabelle, she too has suffered this loss, and she starts to engage in retail therapy and is trying to get over her grief that way. Of course, we all know that doesn't really work. But her house, as a result, becomes, their house becomes filled with objects. And so for Benny, it's a very cacophonous place. Whereas the library, of course, as we all know, is a very quiet place. And the library is filled with speaking objects, right? Books speak to us, after all. That's why we're all here now. But in a library, they know how to, sit quietly on a shelf and speak in their quiet library voices.
And so the book opens with the loss, a catastrophic, awful, almost ridiculous loss, which then unravels in its impact on these two characters. So one of the really important themes is about relinquishing and letting go, and that's not just of objects but also of people. Can you talk a little bit more to that as a process?
The process of letting go.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the Benny's father, Kenji, who was a Japanese jazz musician, a jazz clarinetist who was passionate about Benny Goodman, and so his loss was a tremendous blow to the family, and so really the whole book is about the process of coming to terms with a loss that's that big, this great hole that's left in your life, and I think that in many ways. There's always this question about where books come from, right? And in this case, I think it was really the loss of my own dad, his death, that inspired me to kind of want to investigate that, that grieving, that process of losing a little bit more deeply. And in fact, when my own father died, for about a year after his death, I would hear his voice as well. I would hear him it was very strange. He was always standing behind me on the right-hand side.
So you could actually hear his voice?
I could hear his voice, like, with my ears. And he was always standing on the right-hand side behind me, and I'd be doing something, ordinary, like washing the dishes or folding the laundry or something, and he would clear his throat, and he had a very distinctive way of clearing his throat, and then he would say my name. And this, every time this happened, it was just startling to me. But I didn't really think anything of it. And then little by little, it faded. So I think it was just, I think that was certainly a part of what inspired, me to write the character of Benny.
There is even there's a self-help book that appears as as part of the narrative, and I wondered if you actually wanted to help your readers in some way.
No, I think I was more there's Annabelle is trying very desperately to get her life together.
Yeah.
And she's at a big arts and crafts superstore. And this little book called Tidy Magic jumps off the shelf and lands in her shopping cart. And so she, in this book, in the novel, books have agency. Right, they have will, they have agency. And so it was more that the book wanted to help Annabelle, right, find some way of dealing with her things. Okay. And the book is written by a Japanese, the Tidy Magic book is written by a Japanese Buddhist nun who is pretty shamelessly modeled on Marie Kondo. Yeah. Marie Kondo comes from a Shinto background, and so, but my nun, Icon, comes from a Buddhist Zen background. But it was, I think it was, again, a response to my own life. After my parents died, I'm an only child, and so, cleaning out their house, that terrible job fell to me. And they were both Depression-era people. They were born in 1914. They'd lived through the Great Depression, and they were frugal. They saved everything, right? I mean, every little piece of aluminum foil they would wash and fold, and use again. Same with, plastic wrap. So the house was really, it wasn't untidy, but it was just filled with stuff. And so, it fell to me to somehow get rid of all of that. And I think that was very much, reading Marie Kondo and reading those kinds of clutter clearing books was helpful to me too at the time. And so I think that's how it entered. Yeah.
So this book has agency and jumps into Annabelle's life, but this book also has its own consciousness. And I would like to explore that with you, because it's one of the sort of very interesting things about this book is suddenly the book then clears its throat and starts to address you directly. I'd like to ask you to read a little section of that.
I'd love to. Yeah.
I've got so many stickers in there.
We'll find it. Let's see now. I think it was at the beginning somewhere. There we go.
Thank you.
Okay, so the passage that I'm going to read, this is the book who is speaking. Okay, the book narrator is speaking. And the book has just told the story of how Annabelle and her husband, Kenji, met and fell in love for the first time. Okay? Has it ever occurred to you that books have feelings too? As you listen to this romantic tale of two ill-fated lovers, do you ever stop to wonder what it feels like for us? Because in truth, if skin marks the border where an I ends and a you begins, then in these moments of impassioned boundary crossing called love, we envy you. It's that simple. We envy your bodies. How can we not? Books have bodies too, but ours lack the organs needed to experience the world. The skin that covers our boards and encloses our words is different from yours. Our skin, whether made of paper or parchment or cloth or these days some combination of plastic and glass and metal, fulfills a similar function of marking our perimeters. But even the most haptic and capacitative of skins cannot experience pleasure the way that yours can. We cannot feel the ecstasy, the merging of self and other. Oh, sure, you can say that acts of literature are a kind of impassioned boundary crossing, but literary acts are inherently disembodied, more notional and distributed. We rely on you to embody us, and we exist because you can. So while we are cognizant of your fingers riffling through our pages, and we can describe in words the bitter taste of coffee or a piquant sauce or the salty semen spilled between our folios, we do not experience these sensations as you do, on your tongue, against your skin, inside your human body. It's hard not to feel that we might be missing something. As experts in the field of romance, we have evoked your acts of love in more ways and words than any single human mind could possibly imagine. And yet we will never experience what it feels like to take our beloved's hand and press it to our lips. Oh, that we had lips. It is true that many of us have been loved, hugged, caressed, or even tenderly kissed, and all of this we cherish. But in the moment when real lovemaking commences, we are the ones that get kicked aside and swept off the bed. Discarded, we lie face downward, splayed upon the floor, our pages crumpled, while mysteries unfold above us. Sometimes we think we would like to make love. Who wouldn't? We are madly in love with you, after all. As slaves to your obsession, we know what it feels like to be impressed and bound. But at the same time, we understand that thoughts like these are just idle tropes, fantasies we spin to while away the hours. Fantasies being something that we books excel at. The real stories, the ones that happen, belong to you.
Wonderful, just wonderful. The carnal yearnings of the book in your hand and the book craving to have lips. I just find it fantastic. And shortly after that section, you continue the theme of embodiment and how the words that we read on the page, how that enters us. So almost as a process of ingestion, but where are they? We ingest them with our eyes, with our mind. Where does that exist as an embodiment?
Yes,
it's
that's
very,
right.
very playful and thoughtful,
Yeah.
but also very deep.
It felt that way when I was writing it. Of course, one never knows. I was just having fun, and I was really enjoying, the process of thinking. If a book had sentience, what would it be thinking? What would it be feeling? So it was just fun. And of course, there, so many books, so every book would be different, just like all of us are different. But this book in particular became a character, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
it does have its own personality.
yeah.
I wonder how it would feel about being at the Jaipur Literature Festival.
I think it would
an
be
orgy of books.
I think it would be very happy.
So as I mentioned, that there are parts that are very light, very playful, but some parts are really a struggle to read. I felt so much for Benny. He's such a wonderful and damaged person, and he suffers to an extent with his grieving and with the process of bereavement that I've sometimes wondered, did he suffer too much? And I was put in mind of a quote by T.S. Eliot, who said of Thomas Hardy that he turns the screws, he makes his characters suffer too much, it's almost unbearable. Did you feel that you'd almost moved in that direction?
Well, this is something that the author Karen Joy Fowler is a good friend of mine, and we talk about this all the time. We talk about how much we hate to make our characters suffer, and this, I think, the older we get,
then you appear to try and you're there in the library to try and help them.
Yeah, but you kind of think, why do they have to suffer that much to begin with? And the older I get, and I know Karen feels this way too, the older I get, the more I dislike making my characters suffer. But I also understand that the suffering is very much any kind of intense emotion like that in a book. I write my version of it, but then you read it and you bring, without getting too personal here, you bring your suffering to that moment on the page. And so in a way, what I've found is that I dial down the suffering a lot. I have over the years made my characters suffer, I've just been a little bit more gentle with them than I was at the beginning when I was a brash young novelist. But I think the reason I've done that is because I can count on my readers bringing their hearts and their lived experiences to the page, and I want to keep it open enough so that that's possible, so that there's room on the page for the reader to engage with the characters, right? So I think that, when readers tell me that again, not to be too personal, but when the readers tell me that it's difficult to read, I know something about them, right? And I appreciate the fact that you would do that. You would bring your life to the page and help animate these characters.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I can pick up on your phrase, lived experience, I'd love to explore the idea. One of the elements of this book is that Benny O is a child of mixed heritage, mixed parentage, and I would like you to talk about that and in a child's upbringing, the ideas of code switching, the idea also of the sort of fetishization of mixed heritage children, and there's the moments when Annabelle, as a white woman, feels a sense of terror that people think that it's not her kid.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit around this theme?
Sure. I mean, in my case, my mother is Japanese and my father is Caucasian. And so growing up, I grew up in East Coast in Connecticut, right? And there wasn't a large Asian American community there when I was growing up. So I really stood out as being other. It was also, I was born in 1956, which was 11 years after the end of World War II. And so the Japanese were still very much the enemy in people's minds. And as a mixed race person, Japanese American, with an Asian mother, I mean, the assumption at the time was that my mother was a trophy bride. She wasn't. She and my dad had met getting their PhDs at Yale. But there was this But there was this kind of assumption that my mother was, a geisha girl, who he had picked up.
Something exotic.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing, though, that was difficult, I think, for me to understand was that living in a primarily Caucasian context like this, people would look at me and they would see an Asian face, an Asian little girl, and then they would project their stereotypes of what an Asian Japanese girl should be onto me. But I grew up believing that. I grew up believing that, that I should be everything, all of this, the projections that were, sort of put on me, that I should conform to those because I was clearly, everybody's telling me I'm Japanese, so I must be Japanese. And it wasn't until I went to Japan when I was like 18 or 19 years old, and I was in school there, and Japanese people would look at me and they would treat me like I'm an American, right? And that was the first time I realized that I had two sides. And I also realized that as an American, this was fantastic. I could be loud, I could be obnoxious, I could make people laugh, I could, all of these things that as a little Japanese girl I was not allowed to do, right? And so it kind of balanced things out for me. And I think with Benny too, there's this sense of, his father, who holds the Japanese side of his heritage, has died. And so then how does he navigate that? And that's very much something that I was thinking about as I was writing it.
That's very interesting. Yeah. And can you share with us the story of how you became Ruth Ozeki, which is a wonderful story?
Okay. Ozeki is not my real name. It's my pen name. My real name, my legal name, is Ruth Diana Lounsbury. All right. It just didn't work, right? And so actually it was in India. In 1976, I was traveling around India with some Japanese. I met some Japanese people on the way, and one of the men who I was traveling with was a man named Ozeki, right? And he and I dated for a while, and then we broke up, and I took his name, basically, because I like it.
What did he say about this?
He was fine with it. He didn't, it wasn't something that happened immediately. It happened, decades later when I was starting to make films, when I was starting to write books. My dad, he was leery about his daughter publishing novels that, given who I am, probably would be in some way offensive to him and his Christian fundamentalist family. And so I was, I was getting this kind of vibe from him that he was very nervous, about his sister reading this book that it was my year of meats, and it, as far as he was concerned, had sex, drugs, and rock and roll in it, and it kind of did. And so offered at that point to use the name Ozeki. And I'm so glad I did, because it was very interesting, because I was in the process of editing the book at the time, and so the manuscript came back to me with my editor's notes, and I had another crack at it, knowing that I was going to be publishing under the name Ozeki. And I felt a sense of complete freedom and liberation as a result of that. Yeah, I was no longer holding back out of concern for my dad's feelings. Because of course, I mean, he's my father. I love him. I didn't want to make him unhappy. He was dying at the time. I wanted him to go to, have a peaceful death, not worried about, about this.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I decided to use the name Ozeki, and it stuck, and I've used it ever since.
I think it's a fascinating story because, patriarchally, women assume men's names because it's put on them, whereas you sort of kind of plucked one from somebody.
That's right.
And used it as a process of ownership.
That's right.
And
That's right.
Found that quite liberating as well. I mean, names are really important.
Names are very important. They really are.
And this is again is one of the themes in the book.
That, I probably made a mistake, because the guy Hiroshi ended up becoming a multimillionaire with he has a fashion industry and owns lots of property in Shibuya and stuff like that. But anyway,
Oh.
I met his wife, and she thought it was great that I had taken his name. So.
I'd like to talk a bit about your process as a writer, because we all here celebrate that art, and I know it's a tired question, but it's one that I always love to hear asked. And I enjoyed very much your earlier work. What's the book called where you stare at your face for 3 hours? Apologies, it's just slipped my mind.
Well, it has a different title. It's called Timecode of a Face.
Yes.
Yeah, Timecode of a Face.
And it's an extraordinary sort of writing experiment where Ruth sits in front of a mirror for 3 hours and writes what happens. Can you talk about how that informed your overall writing process?
Sure. I had been approached by a small independent publisher in the States to write an essay on the subject of the face. And the publishing company, Restless Books, had asked several other authors to do the same. Tosh Aw from Indonesia, Chris Abani from Nigeria. And we were all to write these, fairly short essays about the face. And I really like Tosh, and I love Chris, and they're wonderful writers. And I thought, great, anything that they're doing, I'll do, because it sounds really interesting. And so I said yes. And then the deadline started, got closer and closer and closer, and I suddenly realized, shit, I have to write an essay about my face, and I don't really want to do this, And so then the deadline kind of came and went, and to put it briefly, I was desperate. And so as a Zen practitioner, I did what Zen practitioners do, which is to sit down and meditate on the object that is, causing me so much grief, right? And in this case, it was my face. And so I put a mirror up on my Buddhist altar. I feel like this is so sacrilegious, but I put a mirror up on my altar, and then just sat there with my computer in my lap and made a time code of all of the observations that kind of came to mind as I was staring at my face. And the idea actually came from an art historian who wrote an essay called "The Power of Patience," and it's based on an exercise that she gives to her students, which is to sit in front of a work of art for 3 hours and see what kinds of new, observations emerge over time, right? Because of course, I think most of us, we glance at our faces, or we glance at some small part of our faces. If you're putting on lipstick, you're just looking at your lips. But the idea of, of actually forcing yourself, you shouldn't do this, but for me to force myself to, sit for 3 hours and stare at my face, it seemed like an interesting ordeal, and ordeals are always very good places to start any kind of writing. Yeah. Well.
It's a really extraordinary piece of writing. You just mentioned you're a Buddhist practitioner. I would like to talk about your Buddhism and how it informs your writing, but also how it connects you to India, which is, of course, the birthplace. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. I'm a Zen Buddhist practitioner. But of
You
course,
say practitioner rather than priest.
well,
What's-
I'm also a priest. I mean, a practitioner is anybody who practices the tenets of the religion. In my case, I am also an ordained Buddhist priest. I don't think I'm a very good priest, but I have lots of hats that I wear. So, this was something that I think was interested in from a very, very early age. I was interested in meditation. And of course, I mean, part of it was that I grew up during the 1960s and everybody was interested in meditation. But the very first memory I have as a little 3-year-old child, small thing, was when my Japanese grandparents came to visit, and my mother sent me into the bedroom to wake them up for breakfast. And I remember reaching up for the doorknob, right, because I was little, reaching up for the doorknob and opening the door and looking in and seeing my Japanese grandfather sitting on the floor cross-legged, kind of rocking back and forth with his eyes closed. And then he opened his eyes, right, and our eyes made contact. And it was just this kind of mind-blowing moment because, first of all, grown-ups in New Haven, Connecticut don't sit on the floor. They didn't sit on the floor in those days, right? And so this was just the most shocking thing I'd ever seen. And I went running out to my mother and explained the whole thing. And I think she must have told me what they were doing, but it didn't mean anything. But still, I have this feeling that I was like a little duckling, and I kind of imprinted on my grandfather's meditation. And then I just continued to explore it, meditation through high school and college. But it was really when, again, going back to the death of my parents, it was when, sickness, old age, and death, when they started getting older, they started getting sick, and then they started dying. And I, again, as an only child, somehow it fell to me to support them through this, and I just couldn't do it alone. I needed some help, and the help I found was in meditation practice, because it helps you learn to sit up strong, and look at the things that frighten you, and rather than running away, which of course always makes things worse. And so that's really when I got serious about it, and I found it so helpful. I think I just wanted to be in a position to pass that along, those teachings and those practices along to others, and that's why I decided to ask for ordination.
Is it correct to describe it as a faith?
I would call it a faith. Yeah, faith works as a, if anything, it's a faith in human nature. It's a faith in your Buddha nature. It's kind of the opposite of the original sin concept, which never really worked for me. But there's a sense that we all have, this kind, compassionate Buddha, awakened Buddha nature, and that it's just through confusion and delusion and greed and hatred and that gets confused. But if we can learn to sort of work our way through that, then we can recover that original nature, which is a very beautiful thing. And I have to say that I've found that writing has only made that stronger for me, that faith, right?
Yes.
Because I think that's what we learn when we write and put books out in the world, right? That
it is an act of faith.
It is an act of faith, exactly. And that I have so much faith in my readers. I have so much faith in readers who pick up the book.
You will feel it. You can actually feel it in the book. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
But I'd go even further and say it's almost evangelistic. That might not be the correct term. But in your advocating for the power of the written word, for books, for libraries is a big one.
Yeah.
Tell us about libraries as temples, as places of fulfillment, as, I'm also a fan.
Are you? Well, of course you are.
About faith in libraries and what they represent.
Yeah. I grew up in libraries. My mother, again, she was not of a generation where she didn't ever really play with me, because mothers didn't do that back then, or at least she didn't. But she would take me to the library, and she took me to the library at least once a week, and I would go down into the children's area in the basement, and it was this huge basement filled with books. And I thought that the books belonged to the librarians, and they were so nice because they would just let me take any books that I wanted, And I just thought this was amazing. And so I would take home a stack of books, and then I would read them and give them back to the nice librarians. And, we did this. And it was, and that love of libraries has just continued. I've always found refuge in libraries. And the library in this book is largely based on the Vancouver Public Library, the Rem Koolhaus Seattle Public Library. It's sort of a Pacific Northwest library vibe, I think, that's in this book. And that's partly because the first 2 novels that I wrote, I researched in those libraries, right? And so I have a very, sort of soft spot in my heart for them.
Oh, yes, that absolutely
Those were back in the olden days where you actually had to physically go to a library, and look at books.
Well, people still do that.
Yeah, they do.
People go to libraries, right?
Yes.
Thank you. One person goes to the
Yes.
library. Thank you. You're our people.
Thank you.
Well, on that joyful intervention, I think we should come to you for questions now, because I'm sure there'll be plenty. Don't be shy. I'm going to ask our brilliant team to get in quickly with microphones.
Yeah.
So there's a hand up at the back, a pink sleeve is there, and somebody here. Yes, please be ready. But do you want to go first, and then we'll come to... stay standing up, because it's nice to be able to wave at you. Yes, please.
Hello. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Hello. I hope I'm audible now.
Yes.
So, my question is to Ruth. I just wanted to know that you told us that you are the only child. So, there's a lot of pressure that comes with being the only child to 2 parents.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of pressures being executed in your writings.
Yeah.
So, is this some kind of an autobiographical vent that you're expressing through your writing?
That's interesting, because I hadn't actually. One always gets a different perspective on one's work when interacting with an audience. I hadn't actually thought about that, but I think that certainly Benny's experience in this book and now Yasutani's experience in A Tale for the Time Being, it's true. They're both only children, and I think it's partly just that that's the world that I know, and so I don't think I'm trying to make a point about it any more than, just that's a world that I know, and I, not having siblings myself, I would have to. I would have to push to try to imagine what life with a sibling would be like. And maybe that's the next book. Maybe I should do that. Maybe I should, sort of raise the bar there. But I think that all books, in some way, have the seeds of autobiography. I think that's where they come from. Where else could they come from, right? They come from your lived experience somehow. Even if you're writing fantastical, speculative, magic realist fiction, science fiction, it's coming from something that you have experienced, right? So there is always, I think, that autobiographical element there. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Question at the back.
Hi Ruth, hi
Hi.
Bee. Yeah, so while reading the book from Annabelle's perspective,
I'm not. I
you're
can't
not
hear.
audible. So it's audible now, right? So while reading the book from Annabelle's perspective, there was a time, she let go of her health, and she was hoarding things, and she was not on top of her son's academics or what he's doing with his life. And I could feel a lot of shame if I was in her position at that time. I would just want to hide in my house and not interact with anyone.
Yeah.
And there's also a quote in the book which says, why was it that women could never work hard enough to quiet their nagging fear that they were not enough, that they were falling behind, that they could and should be better. But towards the end of the book, I came to the realization that there is no shame in how you deal with your grief or how you deal with a traumatic event. So was this something that you wanted the reader to get from the book?
That's a wonderful question. I think that, to be honest, when I'm writing a book, I'm not really thinking that much about the reader's experience. I'm usually writing the book because it's something that I'm trying to process myself, and I'm trying to write my way into some kind of understanding. And so in this case, I think very much that I was trying to kind of write my way into understanding my own attachment to objects, but also my attachment to my dead parents, and the whole the whole process of letting go. Right. And what is attachment, and why is it that we want things so badly? And what is it about, consumer capitalism that, that feeds our hunger? And why is it that self-help books are so popular now, and that we always think that we need to be other than who we are somehow, be it, a woman with a clean house, or whatever it is, right? Fill in the blank. We always seem to want to or need to be other than who we are, and so those are the kinds of things I think I was, contemplating, thinking about as I was writing the character of Annabelle. Of all the characters, I think there's always one sort of slightly autobiographical character in a book, and to be honest, it was Annabelle for me. I'm not like her in many ways. I'm not a hoarder, but what I do see is the beauty and the potential, the possibility in material objects, right? And Annabelle loves to go to the arts and crafts store because what she sees is all of this, material, right? And she could make things from it. And I think I have that excitement about material objects too, and also about ideas. I certainly feel that way about ideas.
She wants to rescue objects as well. She's a carer, and I love that you've picked up on Annabelle, because there are certain moments where she fails so completely at what she's trying to do. She loves Benny, but she just does not understand. She gets it so wrong, and it's not her fault. Of course, it just speaks to the unknowability of people that you love very much. I thought that was beautifully done.
And with Annabelle too, I remember a very early draft of the book. I gave it to my agent, and she read it, and she liked it, but then she just said, "Oh, that Annabelle." And I felt so sorry for Annabelle, and I thought, no, I'm just going to keep writing Annabelle until I get her right, until she can become a lovable character. And so that was my, I was really working hard on that. This is another interesting, I'll just, a tiny little digression, but, the book is the narrator of the book, right? And so the book is the one who is talking, who is narrating Annabelle's life. And what I noticed in an early draft of the book was that the book's tone of voice was a little bit sardonic, right? That the book, when the book talked about Annabelle, had a slightly snarky, ironic tone to it, right? And that made it very difficult for readers to really feel connected, with Annabelle. And once I discovered that, two things happened. Well, I went through and really radically, rewrote that and tried to take away that kind of biting irony. But the other thing I realized is that that ironic kind of that ironic critical voice is one that I have when I'm thinking about myself, right? When I've done something stupid, my inner critic has a kind of snarky, ironic way of telling me that I've done something stupid. And so in a way, this is, it's through writing a book that you learn to hear the voices that are inside your head that are, sort of forcing you to behave in one way or another, right? And so it's, in so many ways, I think writing fiction in particular is a kind of self-exploration. And so I think this was as well. So thank you for asking that question.
Great question. There are two questions here. There's a person right here, and then woman near the front. Please, can the microphone people get to the people with their hands up so that they're ready to go? And then, yes, standing up person, would you like to ask your question? Keep your hand up if you,
Hi, Ruth.
Hi.
Thank you for giving grief an uncanny home. My question is, the book starts with a Walter Benjamin quote. And he's referenced a lot in the novel. So what part does he play in this book, and how did you write it, and how did he come into this whole book?
Yeah, Walter Benjamin is well, I mean, I love reading Walter Benjamin, so that's a big part of it. I think in this case, the book is set in a library, And a friend of mine, knew that I was writing a book that was set in the library, and said, have you read Walter Benjamin's essay, Unpacking My Library, right? And I'd read it in college, but that was many, many, decades ago. But I still had my Walter Benjamin books. And so I read it, and it was, it just was uncanny how apt his relationship with books was to to what I was writing about. And all of my novels have a kind of guiding spirit. My first novel, it was a 11th century Heian Japan courtier writer named Sei Shonagon, who wrote the Pillow Book, and her quotes are scattered throughout the book. In A Tale for the Time Being, it was Dogen and Proust, right? And so their quotes are kind of through the book. And in this case, it was Walter Benjamin. And it was, and it just was a kind of guiding, he was a kind of guiding light, for me. And so when I wasn't writing, I was reading Benjamin, right? And it was just wonderful to, to kind of have that connection with him. The other thing, I'll just say one other thing that was kind of strange.
But we've got 2 more questions,
Okay.
so say it quickly.
I'll say it quickly.
Sorry.
That Walter Benjamin, there's a snow globe motif in the book. Walter Benjamin collected snow globes. And I did not know that when I started. Yeah.
That's quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
Yes, so our final question will be from you, and then you at the back. Can somebody get the microphone to the gentleman with his hand still up? Yes.
Yeah.
This is more of a personal question.
Yeah.
So you talked about how your experience as a mixed race child impacted your character of Benny.
Yeah.
So as a member of Gen Z who's Indian but has so much exposure of the American culture, we're always kind of stuck in a limbo between what is the American way and what's the Indian way.
Yeah.
Do you think that was a struggle that you faced as a child, and that did it impact your characterization of Benny?
I think absolutely it did. Yeah, I mean, I was really stuck between 2 cultures, and I didn't really belong to either one. I wasn't Japanese. I wasn't really American. I mean, I am American, but I always felt a little bit ambivalent about my own identity in that way. And I also realized that, even though I'm writing about, in all of my books, I write about mixed race Japanese American characters, I just decided that I don't know, I wanted to do it that way, and so I did. But I realized too that we're all, we all, as you point out, are mixes of some sort, right? Even if, we're cultural mixes, we're ethnic mixes, we're racial mixes, we're gender mixes, we all live on a kind of spectrum of some sort, right? So that definitely did enter my thinking about Benny. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And our final question there.
First, thank you very much.
Yeah,
Then, I haven't read your book yet, but I will.
okay.
Still, since we're here, my wife and I have been studying and practicing with Buddhist teachers for a long time. A Zen Buddhist practitioner and Zen Buddhist priest calls her book a book of form and emptiness.
Yeah.
I have to ask, but I don't want to say anything too specific. Would you say a little something about that? I'm sure you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah.
Or should I just read the book and... That's-
You can read the book,
We'll
but
read
I'll
the book
also
anyway,
answer.
But
I'll
please
also
speak to
answer.
it.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you.
I'll also answer the question. Yeah, the phrase "form and emptiness" comes from a very central Mahayana Buddhist sutra called the Heart Sutra, or the Heart of Great Perfect Wisdom Sutra, and it's a very brief line in there, which goes, form is not different from emptiness, emptiness is not different from form. Form itself is emptiness, emptiness itself form. And so really what this line is, without getting into kind of the deeper philosophical sort of ramifications, it's basically pointing out that we are all deeply and radically interconnected. Right. It's pointing to the truth of dependent co-arising, and that's so. In other words, it's pointing to the truth about relationships, that we cannot exist, we don't exist in the world alone, even though we feel that way so much of the time. But in fact, we are completely, and radically interconnected with everything and everyone else in the world. Right. And so this is I think what the book is about. It's about Benny, this young boy who feels completely cut off and isolated, but who then, by going to the library, finds a community of people who can support him and help him be who he is, right? And I think that was certainly one of the things I was thinking about as I was writing it. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you.
I forgot to ask about the title, so thanks for doing my job for me. I would like to thank you for being Ruth Ozeki, you for being a brilliant audience. Everybody buy this book. It's wonderful. It will just take you through the year with kindness and joy, and you can get it signed by Ruth here at the back, so don't waste time. And please give Ruth a huge round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Well done, well done.